Hey everybody, it is I guess it's Wednesday, Wednesday, January 4th, 2023. My God, brand new year and the shit show that's on display in front of our eyes is remarkable. It's obviously a continuation of what we were dealing with at the end of the year, but just take for example in consideration what we're seeing unfold right before our eyes. The big news, of course, is the battle on the right for the Republicans to vote for McCarthy as the Speaker of the House. As of this moment, it's just gone through four different votes, and they still don't have a Speaker of the House, which is absurd when they have control. They can't even agree amongst themselves, who's going to be the Speaker of the House and how they're going to set their agenda moving forward. So it's a civil war on the right that is extremely embarrassing to the Republican Party if they had any shame. But there's no shame. Let's consider, for example, this representative from the 3rd District of New York, George Santos. What a piece of work this guy is. He's somewhere in between the talented Mr. Ripley and George Costanza. I don't know whether to laugh. I don't know whether I want to fall out of my chair, hit my knee, die crying, because it's like a skit literally out of a Mel Brooks, satire. It's literally just like insane that the media is saying, "Oh my God, this guy is a complete outright liar." He lied about his work experience, and he said things like he worked at Goldman Sachs, he worked at Citi, and he was in private equity, and a whole host of other lies. But he's also being found out to be nothing but just a fraud. And this guy's like 34 years old, and I believe he's also under investigation or being, I don't know, indicted in some level of, speaking of, check kiting, I think, for a suit down in Brazil, of all things. And I think the thing that got me the most yesterday was when I was listening to him saying that he was Jewish with a hyphen. I was thinking to myself with his name Santos, it didn't sound very Jewish, but he said that he was Jewish, as in Jew hyphen ish, as he affiliated in a sort of a cultural sort of way with Jews. Obviously, the 3rd District of New York, maybe that makes sense. And apparently the guy is either bisexual or something. Not like there's anything wrong with that. To pull from Costanza and Seinfeld, for those of you who know the reference. But, I mean, guys, this is absolutely absurd. The media itself, right, in the run-up to the midterms was like, I mean, it's a horse race, and it's the numbers and who's going to win and the red wave and what's going to happen with the agenda in light of what's happening with January 6th insurrection committee hearings and all things Donald Trump and that sea and cacophony and ocean of madness and lies. What would we expect than somebody like this guy George Santos to come around? Which for me lends itself to, well, where do you get his campaign contributions? Who were those that pushed him forward, and for what purpose? Especially if, certain policy or protocol or bills or anything could win by just a razor's edge because of just, the lay of the land in both houses, quite frankly. But we're going to end up with a paralyzed Congress once again, which tends to happen typically in the second phase of any presidential term. I mean, that's been pretty much the go-to for decades when I think about it. I think going back to the Reagan administration, America tends to like a divided house. And it makes sense, but this is a divided house of just monstrous stupidity. And when you consider the likes of the media not having any idea or inclination about what Sam Bankman-Fried was in the midst of, in the context of spending millions upon millions of dollars for the midterm campaigns, of which his biggest contributions were to none other than the President of the United States. As it's been reported, he was the second highest contributor to President Joe Biden, behind, George Soros. I mean, that's pretty elite company, right? Not to mention all of the millions of dollars that he had provided to the Republicans, apparently through backdoor channels and dark areas, because that's the way that they've created the law of the land, and that's, everybody's got their hands out. And I continue to say, we live in an era where, were nothing but pimps, whores, and junkies. And I'm talking about the elites. I don't know why I laugh at that, because it's absolute madness. When I put together the con, when I first started to figure this out, the first question that I had to resolve in my own mind, having lived through the 2008 great financial crisis, was it didn't make sense. And so I have this insatiable curiosity. And so I start pulling the threads. And once I put this behemoth, massive, criminality together piece by piece of this giant puzzle that took down the global economy, in the end, I always say it's not rocket science, it's racketeering. And it really isn't rocket science by any stretch. But what we're in the midst of with everything that I just discussed in terms of this insanity of what's happening with the civil war for control of the Speaker of the House, but most on display with the election of this guy, George Santos. I mean, people, have we hit rock bottom yet? I mean, I swear to God, it's not like we didn't know that we've had problems for decades, but this is an absolute, utter insanity. Now, interestingly enough, another sort of thread and a through line that seems to be echoed all the time, and I'm starting to have my own theory on this, but what I observed on Twitter a couple of weeks ago was really incredible. There was this sort of orchestration from people that were being let back on Twitter that were expressing, I guess, an echo chamber of what we might construe as the right, that were see, the FBI had, censored us and all of these other elements. But one thing that kept coming up over and over and over again was this sort of paranoia towards child sex trafficking and obviously raping children sort of thing. And I'm like, God, this is awkward. It's weird. It's not like I wasn't aware that, really terrible things exist out there, particularly as we saw, related to the Catholic Church and the priests and everything, that have been going on for, quite frankly, decades, probably centuries. Oppressed sexuality is one thing, but, to have a flock go to, the congregation and be aware that the priest is preying on their children and everybody not saying anything. That's, to me, it's absolutely shocking, right? And, the revelation of that is still kind of like, oh my God. But to have this sort of paranoia on the right comes from this notion of all things from Pizzagate and Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Jeffrey Epstein and the whole sexual sort of odyssey with billionaires to where they, provide these sort of paradise pleasure camps, if you will, for sexual fulfillment being used to leverage rich people. For one, should just show you that rich people are stupid too when they're thinking with their dick, for one thing. But, another thing is that, it's gross and it's disgusting, but, blood libel and Pizzagate and the Democrats raping children and all of these types of things. In context to what we're hearing, it seems like a little bit of projection to me, quite frankly, which is gross and it's awkward, but it's like, okay. And you find out today, for example, that the SEC fined Coinbase, which I believe is on the floor of the Dallas Mavericks when they play. I happened to see that over, I think on a Christmas Day basketball game of the Dallas Mavericks. I was thinking through FTX, and I know at the Dallas Cowboys stadium they had blockchain advertised, on the monitors at every quarter. So that's a big spin for whoever is behind, the advertisement for blockchain to legitimize it. Not to mention, of course, Bitcoin. Or CoinDesk, I'm sorry. And CoinDesk got sued by the SEC because, as it turns out, that the grift was that they were allowing participants in their financing and banking and the structure and so forth to be companies that had tentacles involved with drug dealing, as well as money laundering, and then, of course, sex trafficking and pornography, which, of course, a lot of people have said about crypto the whole time, and not to confuse it with Bitcoin and blockchain and everything else, but the whole purpose of the so-called decentralization and the I guess on the one hand transparency, on the other hand though being able to work outside of the system. For a lot of entities, it's the underworld and laundering for these things that are involved. So I find myself peculiarly asking, well, wait a second, is this everything that Donald Trump does is what I learned back in college. Not to say that I associated with anybody like Donald Trump, but in a fraternity, in the world of fraternities, you learn at the very beginning that, when shit hits the fan, you circle the wagons and it's lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate. Now, because I'm an ethical guy and I've never wanted to bully anybody in my life and it's not my style, I never played that game, but I was certainly aware of it. And I've done my fair share of stuff, that was illegal, and you don't break the law when you're breaking the law, especially when you're young and stupid. But the bottom line is there's levels and degrees of things that you make mistakes about. But this is like absolute insanity, right? So any sort of consideration of sex trafficking and proliferation of minor predation and that sort of thing is just so beyond my wildest imagination. I mean, it's not something that's even ever in my sort of reference, right? So it's not something I ever think about. But this projection on the right feels to me like it's this Trumponian scenario that I just expressed the formula, which is lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate. Then lo and behold, you find out that Coinbase and blockchain and crypto and all of these other elements are just basically facilitating the underworld, of which could go to support potential, candidates that end up winning seats in the House that I mentioned before is like this guy, George Santos, who is the talented Mr. Ripley meets George Costanza. It's a shit show of monumental proportions. I have the answers that are trillions of times bigger than Watergate. We have had a nonstop race to the bottom because of corruption. None of this is possible without corruption. And the worst part of it is our media is an abject failure. To go back to Sam Bankman-Fried and crypto and I'm sorry, and his donations to both parties, he also bought media. I can't tell you how many different independent media were the recipients of his largesse. Not to mention, I think that's why all of the mainstream media was up in arms, and they paid for celebrities, and he bought influence, and all of these other things. People, how stupid are we as a society? We're not that stupid. We're really not. It's just the problem is those that are on top. Remember, the elites are the pimps, whores, and junkies. You're better than that. And if you are better than that, please follow, please subscribe, please share everything that I'm saying. Please endeavor yourself to go see the work that we've done, which is the work that BlackRock, the kingpins of this fucking circus, cannot have you see, which is at www.thecon.tv. And maybe even more importantly, it's not more important, but just, recently, I did this on 11/1/22. If you go to YouTube and you go to Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs the Con and you click on live, you'll see what I regard as a filibuster to the grand jury of the American people, where I spent 11 hours filibustering, showing the evidence of exactly what took place to create the 2008 great financial crisis and then the cleanup in the aftermath that just whitewashed and buried tens of millions of people being buried illegally by a theft. And again, going back to the beginning, like I said, it's not rocket science, it's racketeering. But this stuff is infinitely more, shall we say, complicated in terms of delivering than somebody like George Santos. People, you've got to open up your eyes to what's going on. The media is just a tool to basically hide things from you because they're really too stupid to understand how it works. I've seen that over and over and over. I don't walk on water. I don't part the Red Sea. I'm just a guy that knows what he's doing. Please help me help the country get this information to the world as soon as possible. We've got to purge corruption. The time to move forward is now. Onwards and upwards.